Well, thank you all for being here. So to delve into this conversation about money and its future, I thought it might be helpful to tell you a little bit about all of the people who are furious with me right now. And they're furious about this idea that cash might be gone someday. And I think this is a helpful way to sort of touch on some of the themes that I was gunning to introduce in the book. And then after a short reading, we can do some Q&A. Okay, so the angry people. What happened to me about 4 or 5 years ago is I, like many people, was getting interested in the costs of manufacturing pennies and nickels, which some people might know. Right now, it costs about 2.5 cents to make a penny. So it costs a lot more than the value stamped into the object itself. And nickels right now are around 10 cents per nickel, which is just, I mean, it's almost like you have to say it again, 10 cents per nickel. So I was seeing a lot of this in the news. Like a lot of people, there's a group called Citizens to Retire the Penny. They were getting mocked on Colbert Report and in the Wall Street Journal. To those of us who have a sort of rationale streak, this was, it's crazy, but on the other hand, we understood, well, they're not necessarily going to get anywhere. Well, then I started looking into the costs of cash sort of more broadly in society, and I proposed to an editor at Wired this idea that maybe we could just put together a short essay saying, well, let's get rid of cash altogether. So much of our lives are moving to the digital realm. Movies, music, books sometimes for some of us. Why not cash? This is a technology also, and yet it is quite analog. So we published this little essay, and people go bananas. And so this is sort of peculiar inconsistency number one about our world, is that cash, to this great extent, we have pushed it to the margins of our everyday lives already. Unless you're a serial tax evader here, you're probably not paying your rent or your mortgage with a fistful of cash, let alone your car payments or buying a sofa or a new sweater or even dinner tonight. Cash is kind of on the edges already. It's also, not really part of the modern economy in any enormous way, right? So most transactions now and most of the money zipping around the globe is all zeros and ones on computers anyway. And yet, if you pseudo-formally or pseudo-officially or publicly suggest, well, maybe its time has come, people go crazy. Okay, so the haters, where are they coming from? They're coming from every ideological and political position on the spectrum. So first is sort of the, you will have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. This is kind of your militiamen set. If they're not hiding income, they don't want to be connected to the government. They want all transactions to be anonymous. Then you have your sort of ACLU on hyperdrive. Everybody has kind of submitted to the idea that electronic money in our lives is useful. You have a bank account, maybe you have a credit card. That's just a payment option. It's not electronic money in general. But most of us have kind of given in to this idea. And yet if you say, well, let's nuke cash, everyone says, whoa, 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 Big Brother's going to be watching me. Now the banks and the credit card companies are going to be monitoring all of my transactions, as if they didn't already live in that world. So you get this kind of recoil response. Another group you have, less sort of impassioned, but I hear from a lot of people, oh, I don't know, there's just something about the physical. There's just something about the physical. A lot of people who don't love ebooks, frankly. They love to hold something. And I think embedded in that response is also a much more sincere concern that people seem to hold on to cash more tightly. And we can talk about this a little bit more, but the credit card effect, it catalyzes spending, and that is a huge problem for a lot of people. Americans right now are on the hook for about $800 billion in credit card debt. So not small numbers at all. Some of the other haters, I assume a lot of mafioso out there and drug dealers don't like me very much because cash, of course, is the currency of crime. They're not writing me email per se, but I'll let you know if they stop by my house or anything like that. So on the cost of cash a little bit, before I tell you a little bit more about what's actually in this book, you go from the penny and the nickel, then you zoom up to the $100 bill, the $50 bill. And right now, roughly speaking, no one knows the exact numbers, cash management in the US is about $150 billion a year, right? So that's 3 times the budget of the Department of Education. So what is cash management? That's just making it available to you at the register at the ATM, and even at the ATM in some far-flung corner of the country. What that number doesn't include is anything to do with crime, for example. So there were 10,000 bank robberies in the US in 2009, 2010. That's just people going after the physical stuff. Of course, there is electronic crime, and there is financial crime in cyberspace. That's not really this conversation per se. So that is a huge cost. We have to pay the cops to go after those folks. We then have to pay to prosecute them and incarcerate them. We, the taxpayers, we're funding, the war on drugs. Well, the drug lords, they love Benjamins. That's how they transact. And so you see these costs kind of circling back against us or on us. So this is one of the ideas that I wanted to suggest with this book is, cash, who doesn't love it to a certain extent? Of course, I want a big pile of it, you want a big pile of it in a way. But when you scrutinize cash for the length of time that I did and from sort of 12,000 feet up, you see it has these much wider costs that no one would ever really consider, even just as a vector for disease transmission. I mean, cash is filthy. I think at this point I'm kind of a germaphobe and have an unhealthy distaste for cash's yuckiness, but still, it's an issue. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to pursue. And early on in this project, I really thought, this is kind of going to be a cross between kind of a Valentine for cash and a eulogy, right? It's on its way out soon enough, that punchy, wired tone. Here we go, just like movies and music. And I really thought I would be writing just about these rectangular slips of paper and little metal plugs. And that would kind of be the extent of it. But as soon as you start to wonder more about where cash comes from and what it means and what its place is in our lives, you can't help but touch on many of these wider questions about cash's history, about the gold standard, about national currencies. What is a central bank? I mean, when I was composing this project, one of my friends said, you got to steer clear of central banks. I mean, you don't want to be that guy who's writing about, oh yeah, great advice, because you're struggling to shape your narrative. And the reality is you cannot talk about cash in any intelligent way without at least talking about where it comes from, where it's born. So this was another sort of angle that I wanted to take. Then, of course, there's kind of the technology side to things, too, and we'll talk a little bit more about mobile phone technology and what that means, especially in poorer parts of the world. So suddenly it's kind of going off in all of these different directions. And what I wanted to do as best I could is kind of keep the lens on wondering about, well, what is money? What is cash? What is value? How do these things work? And yet always trying to come back to the tactile stuff. And so what I mean by that is, I flew to Iceland to do a kind of post-mortem on the financial collapse that they experienced a couple of years ago. And so if this is unfamiliar to anyone here, Iceland had what is, to date, the biggest banking collapse in the history of humanity. Overnight, their stock exchange lost about 90% of its value. And the Icelandic krona, the national currency, lost like 2/3 of its value overnight. So I went over there to explore this idea, but again, just wondering about the cash and national currency. What does it mean to be a country? And what does it mean to have your own money? And at the time, this might sound incredibly dated because we are in the midst of the ongoing euro crisis, but at the time, Icelanders were wondering, well, maybe we should get rid of the krona. We don't necessarily need it to be a country and to maintain our economy. Again, that sounds crazy. Now they're so happy they don't have the euro. But at the time, that was sort of part of the conversation. So I went over there to interview a woman who designed Iceland's national banknotes. And talking about this quote-unquote heritage that you can hold in your hand. Because physical money, of course, this is like one of the last touchstones of national identity, really. And yet she had some very practical things to say when it comes to the fate of money and what it means to be a nation. So anyway, I'm pursuing all of these different angles. The last one I'll touch on is kind of the psychology question, right? And this circles back to the credit card effect and how we seem to be hypnotized, really, by credit cards and spend more compared to using cash and our biases for physical money. And there's this great study that I discuss in the book by these researchers at the University of Minnesota that I'll tell you about just briefly. They split their subjects into two separate groups. And this half of the room, they asked people to count out just rectangular slips of paper, maybe in the same dimension of banknotes, let's say. No artistry, no images, whatever. This side, you're counting out regular cash. It's not even your own money. You're just touching the stuff.